The Vought F4U-4 Corsair is one of the most iconic aircraft in history. It remained in production for 11 years, longer than any other American fighter. It was also the last piston-engined fighter in production for American forces. After entering combat in 1943, the F4U gave Allied pilots a winning advantage against their enemies. Renowned for its speed, ruggedness, and firepower, the Corsair excelled as both a fighter and an attack aircraft during the latter half of World War II, with an 11-to-1 kill ratio. But its most iconic feature is the peculiar sound it made when at high speed, which earned it the nickname Whistling Death. At the beginning of 1938, the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics began soliciting new fighter aircraft proposals with global conflict on the horizon. Both single-engine and twin-engine proposals were welcomed. Amongst those who entered the competition was the Vought Corporation. Their design was centered on the ubiquitous Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. To maximize the engine's power, they selected a large Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller. And while the engine certainly enhanced the aircraft's performance, it presented problems on other design elements. Since the propeller was exceptionally large, it was challenging to make the landing gear struts long enough to provide for ground clearance. To solve this problem, the designers switched to an inverted gull wing. To keep the fighter aircraft as aerodynamically clean as possible, Vought designers made sure there were no protrusions into the surrounding air to reduce additional drag. They also included their innovative bent wing design and an intercooler and air cooler in slots inside them. The pilot was seated in a large cockpit placed over the wing trailing edge. The engine cowling view was low, even more than in other single-seat fighters of the day. The side view was average, even though the cockpit canopy was heavily framed. The tailplanes and fins were rounded, and the control surfaces were covered in fabric. Pleased with Vought's progress, the U.S. Navy signed a contract for a prototype in June 1938. Additional production contracts were farmed out to Goodyear and Brewster, who, using the Vought's Corsair design, produced the FG and F3A versions. Vought's first prototype flew on May 29, 1940. In October of the same year, the XF4U-1 prototype averaged 405 miles per hour on a flight from Stratford to Hartford, Connecticut. It became the first U.S. fighter aircraft to break the 400 miles per hour barrier. The problem still persisted, despite the plane's overall satisfactory performance. It would never shake its reputation of being prone to stalling at low speeds. Even worse, inverted gull wings tended to stall on either only the left or right side, depending on circumstances, making it difficult to recover. To mitigate the plane's unusual stall characteristics, designers installed a small spoiler on the wing's leading edge and added a new stall warning. When World War II began in Europe, the Navy had no choice but to alter the requirements and ask the aircraft's armament to be enhanced. Vought complied by equipping the new prototypes with 6 50-caliber machine guns in the wings. This addition forced the removal of fuel tanks initially located in the wings, expanding the fuselage tank and moving the cockpit 35 inches aft. The cockpit's movement and the aircraft's long nose made it even more difficult to land, especially for inexperienced pilots. But most other problems were eliminated, and so the design was greenlit into production in mid-1942. Additional issues, however, quickly arose in September 1942, when the Corsair underwent carrier qualification trials. Several problems were discovered with its landing gear, tailwheel, and tailhook. Since the F-6F Hellcat was coming into service in the Navy simultaneously, the U.S. Marine Corps deterred the Corsair release until all landing problems were resolved. The Corsair finally entered island-based Marine service in the Southwest Pacific at the end of 1942 and began flying in large numbers over the Solomons in 1943. Marine pilots enjoyed flying the Corsair, especially since its speed and armament power gave it a significant advantage over the Japanese A6M0. The F4U quickly became famous as it racked up impressive kill numbers against the Japanese. Air running through the Corsair's wing-mounted intake slots while flying at high speeds gave the aircraft a unique sound. Americans claim that the Japanese tagged the fighter with the moniker Whistling Death, although some records dispute those accounts. Most Japanese documentation reportedly referred to it as the Sikorsky. The F4U was only used by the Marines until the Navy began flying in 1943. And in 1944, the aircraft was certified for carrier operations. The Hellcat and the Corsair joined forces protecting U.S. ships from kamikaze attacks. In addition to being a fighter, the F4U extensively worked as a fighter-bomber. It was vital in providing close support to Allied troops slugging their way across the Pacific. The Corsair was also used as a fighter-bomber in the Central Pacific and the Philippines. In 1944, Marine pilots began to utilize the F4U's abilities in a close support role in amphibious landings. Notably, Charles Lindbergh flew several Corsairs with the Marines. He managed to get one F4U into the air with 2,000 pounds of bombs in the center line and 1,000 pounds of bombs in each wing. In these experiments, he performed strikes against Japanese positions during the Marshall Islands battle. By 1945, the Corsair worked as a full-blown mud fighter and performed strikes in the muck of battle with high-explosive bombs, napalm, and high-velocity aircraft rockets. The aircraft was a crucial participant in the fighting for Palau, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. During one of the most iconic battles of the war, one American Corsair pilot famously survived ramming into a Japanese fighter. The Japanese attacked in many ways, but their kamikaze, suicide pilots who rammed their planes into guided missiles, were the most dreaded. Consequently, the Allied forces had to strengthen their defenses with layers upon layers of fighter patrols, radar pickets, and anti-aircraft. On the morning of May 10, 1945, two U.S. Marine pilots, Captain Kenneth Reuser and First Lieutenant Robert Klingman, were flying their Vought F4U Corsairs on combat air patrol 10 miles away from the Kadena airfield in Okinawa, along with two other pilots. Captain Reuser spotted vapor trails above the patrol. He ascended to investigate, and since the other two pilots weren't as experienced, Reuser and Klingman continued alone. When they were over 38,000 feet in the air, the pilots intercepted a Kawasaki Ki-45. When they approached, the Japanese plane turned away to the north and tried to outrun them. The Marine pilots kept up and fired off half their ammunition to lighten the aircraft. Their strategy worked. Reuser got into range and fired the other half of his ammo at the fleeing Ki-45. Firing numerous times, the Japanese plane's right wing got severely damaged, which made the right engine burst into flames. Klingman then knew it was time to finish what Reuser started. The lieutenant lined up for a final shot, but his guns were frozen because of the altitude. Giving up wasn't an option, so Klingman decided to use his own aircraft's propeller to finally bring the Ki-45 down. Reuser distracted the Japanese crew by flying on its flank while Klingman closed in. The enemy began firing at him just as Klingman came up behind them and sliced into its rudder with his own propeller. But it wasn't enough. So Klingman made two more passes at the Ki-45, slicing into the tail and completely severing the rudder and right stabilizer. The Japanese aircraft spun out of control and crashed into the South Pacific Ocean, just miles off the Okinawa shoreline. And despite damaged wings and bullets in the engines, Klingman was able to make a landing without power going to the propeller directly from the engine. This F4U Corsair was repaired and eventually returned to service. Both Reuser and Klingman were awarded the Navy Cross for their courageous actions that day. The Corsair was nicknamed the Angel of Okinawa for its role in the battle. The data surrounding the Corsair's performance is staggering. By the end of World War II, the Corsairs were credited with taking down 2,140 Japanese aircraft, against only 189 losses, an impressive kill ratio of 11-1. During its service in the conflict, the F4Us flew 64,051 sorties, of which only 15% were from carriers. It also serviced other Allied air arms. The Corsair dropped over 15,500 tons of bombs during the war, approximately 70% of the total bombs dropped by U.S. fighters. Regardless of the accuracy of its usage, Its Whistling Death nickname is well deserved. The Corsair's performance was superior to most of its contemporary aircraft. It was faster than the F-6F Hellcat and only 13 miles per hour slower than the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The F4U, however, could reach its maximum speed while flying at only 20,000 feet, thanks to its mechanically supercharged engine. The P-47 could only reach top speed at 30,000 feet. All three aircraft were powered by the same Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp engine. The F4U Corsair was the only World War II fighter that continued into production after the war ended. They remained in the Navy and Marine service well into the 1960s. From the first prototype in 1940 to its final delivery with the French in 1953, 12,751 F4U Corsairs were manufactured in 16 different models. Its almost 11-year production run is the longest of any U.S. piston-engined aircraft fighter. The Navy later alerted the Corsairs to use them in night fights in post-World War II combat. Lieutenant Guy Bordelon achieved the only ace status given to an F4U during the Korean War by shooting down 5 enemy planes. He was also the only ace of the conflict to make all his kills with a propeller airplane, giving him the last propeller ace in history. During the Korean War, Corsair mostly engaged Yak-9 fighters. After the Soviet-backed Chinese and North Koreans introduced the jet-powered MiG-15, the F4U was demoted to ground support only. Corsairs continued in service with numerous countries through the 1960s, such as when the French flew them in Indochina and Algeria. The Corsair last saw combat in 1969 during the Football War between El Salvador and Honduras. The conflict coincided with rioting during a FIFA World Cup qualifier between the two countries. A Vought F4U Corsair flown by Honduran Captain Fernando Soto shot down 1 P-51 Mustang and 2 Goodyear FG Corsairs. The U.S. Navy officially retired the aircraft after the Korean War.